In 1988, an Italian production crew flew to Massachusetts specifically because American horror fans had developed a reputation for being the easiest audience in the world. To convince that a witch curse could happen anywhere, even somewhere as mundane as a New England island house. They were right. The film barely registered in Italy. Americans found it on VHS and never let it go. That same instinct runs through everything on tonight's list. Horror films from the 1980s, almost entirely Italian productions, almost entirely ignored everywhere except the one country whose video rental shelves had room for absolutely anything. Subscribe if you want this channel to keep finding films nobody else covers. Hell of the Living Dead, 1980, directed by Bruno Mattei. A toxic gas leak at a New Guinea chemical research facility reanimates the dead across the surrounding region, and a team of commandos sent to investigate the initial incident finds themselves trapped between an advancing zombie horde and a documentary film crew who arrived hoping to capture exactly this kind of catastrophe on camera. Bruno Mattei built the production using stock footage liberally borrowed from actual nature documentaries, blending genuine wildlife and tribal ceremony footage directly into his fictional narrative in a way that created a genuinely disorienting, almost found footage texture decades before that technique became its own recognized subgenre. The film entered American distribution almost exclusively through VHS rental channels under multiple alternate titles, including Zombie Creeping Flesh and Virus, a deliberate multi-title strategy distributors used to maximize shelf placement across different regional video chains who might otherwise have recognized it as the same product. Margaret Evelyn Newton leads the cast with a performance built around sustained physical endurance rather than dramatic range. The production's punishing practical shooting conditions in Spain, doubling for New Guinea locations, leaving little room for anything beyond pure survival mode filmmaking. The detail worth knowing involves the soundtrack, an almost exact replication of Goblin's score for Dawn of the Dead, so close that some American distributors reportedly assumed it was an official licensing arrangement, when in fact the music was an uncredited sound-alike composition created specifically to evoke that association without paying for it. Hell of the Living Dead has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Bruno Mattei directed dozens of additional low-budget genre films throughout his career under multiple pseudonyms. The Spanish filming locations have been identified by several genre historians studying Italian exploitation production patterns. Hell of the Living Dead built its horror from stolen documentary footage and a borrowed musical identity. The next film abandoned the zombie format entirely for something considerably more theological, treating an actual convent as the site of demonic infiltration most American audiences encountered through word of mouth alone. The Other Hell, 1981. Directed by Bruno Mattei, a series of unexplained deaths inside an isolated convent prompts church investigation, leading a young priest to discover that one of the nuns may be possessed, or may simply be the victim of an elaborate cover-up involving the convent's own internal hierarchy, protecting something considerably more disturbing than demonic possession alone. Bruno Mattei returned to direct this loosely connected continuation of the Italian nunsploitation horror cycle, building the production around the genre's established convent set dread, while pushing the practical gore effects considerably further than most prior entries had attempted. American distribution remained limited almost entirely to specialty horror, VHS labels catering specifically to collectors seeking unrated international horror, a niche distribution path that meant most American audiences discovered the film exclusively through word of mouth within dedicated horror fan communities, rather than any general video store browsing. The convent setting, filmed using an actual historic religious building whose management reportedly remained unaware of the production's full content during filming, gave Mattei's camera a genuine architectural authenticity no soundstage construction could have replicated on the same budget. The detail worth flagging involves the production's title confusion specifically. American distributors released it under at least 4 different alternate titles depending on regional market, including Guardian of Hell and Inferno dei Morti Viventi, a naming inconsistency so severe that collectors spent years uncertain whether they were discussing one film or several entirely separate productions. The Other Hell has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Bruno Mattei continued working prolifically across multiple genres throughout the decade. The actual convent filming location has never been officially confirmed by production records. The Other Hell used institutional religious cover to disguise its horror. The next film abandoned Europe entirely for the South American jungle, where Jesus Franco staged cannibalism, captivity, and survival horror using the same fast, efficient production methods that had defined his entire prolific career. White Cannibal Queen, 1980. Directed by Jesus Franco. A young woman raised among an isolated jungle tribe after surviving a plane crash as a child becomes the focal point of conflict when a group of outsiders arrives seeking treasure rumored to be hidden within the tribe's territory, forcing a confrontation between her adopted cannibalistic community and the explorers who underestimate exactly what they have walked into. Jesus Franco, working at the height of the European cannibal cycle's commercial momentum, built the production using his characteristically rapid shooting schedule, treating the jungle setting with the same efficient, low-overhead approach he had applied to dozens of prior genre productions, regardless of subject matter. American distribution occurred almost exclusively through gray market import channels and mail-order catalogs, specifically targeting collectors of unrated international horror, with no major American distributor ever submitting the film for theatrical certification. Given the cannibal cycle's already established reputation for triggering obscenity concerns following Cannibal Holocaust's notorious legal troubles in Italy, the film's practical effects work, blending staged violence with suggestive editing techniques designed to imply more graphic content than the actual budget could realistically deliver, became a defining characteristic of Franco's broader approach to the genre throughout this period of his career. The detail worth knowing involves the cast itself. Franco populated significant portions of the tribal sequences using local non-professional performers recruited directly from the actual filming location, a cost-saving production choice that also generated some of the genuine ethnographic visual texture critics have since noted distinguishes his cannibal cycle entries from more obviously staged competitors. White Cannibal Queen has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Jesus Franco directed an estimated 200 films across his career. The specific South American filming locations have not been definitively identified by film historians.
That's how you killed my father and mother.
Clerk, read the charges against the defendant.
White Slave 1985, directed by Mario Gariazzo. A young Italian woman traveling through the Amazon following a plane crash is captured by an isolated tribe and gradually integrated into their community through a combination of survival necessity and genuine psychological transformation, blurring the line between captivity and belonging in ways that the surrounding cannibal cycle rarely attempted with this much actual narrative ambition. Mario Gariazzo built the production at the tail end of the European cannibal genre's commercial relevance, attempting to inject more genuine character development into a formula most competing productions treated purely as a vehicle for shock content. American distribution occurred almost entirely through specialty VHS import labels, the film entering collector circulation under at least 2 different alternate titles depending on regional packaging, a naming inconsistency that has made definitively cataloging the production's full American release history genuinely difficult for film historians even decades later. Elvire Audrey plays the central captured woman, with a performance that several retrospective critics have specifically praised for finding genuine emotional complexity within a genre framework that typically offered its lead performers almost nothing beyond pure physical endurance. The detail worth knowing involves the film's ending, which the Italian theatrical cut and the American VHS release reportedly differ on significantly, with collectors spending years comparing competing print sources before generally concluding that at least 2 distinct edited versions circulated simultaneously without any clear official explanation for why the discrepancy existed in the first place. White Slave has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Mario Gariazzo directed across multiple genres throughout his career. Elvire Audrey's performance has been increasingly reassessed by genre scholars studying the cannibal cycle's later, more narratively ambitious entries. White Slave attempted genuine emotional depth inside a genre built for shock alone. The next film abandoned the jungle completely for an isolated farmhouse, where Italian filmmakers proved the most unsettling threat sometimes comes from something with feathers rather than fangs. Killing Birds 1987, directed by Claudio Lattanzi. A group of researchers studying wildlife at an abandoned Louisiana plantation discover that the surrounding swampland harbors something considerably more dangerous than the rare owl species they originally came to document. As a former Vietnam veteran's psychological trauma intertwines with an escalating series of bird attacks that the production stages with genuinely unsettling practical creature effects for its modest budget level. Claudio Lattanzi built the film around a deliberately disorienting structure, blending psychological horror elements connected to the veteran's wartime memories directly into the more straightforward nature horror premise the marketing emphasized. American distribution remained limited primarily to specialty horror VHS labels, the film entering collector circulation as part of the broader wave of Italian-produced horror specifically targeting the American video rental market that had become significantly more receptive to unusual genre hybrids than mainstream theatrical distributors ever were. Lara Wendell plays one of the central researchers with a performance grounded in increasing physical exhaustion, as the production's genuinely difficult Louisiana location shooting tested the cast against actual swampland conditions rather than any controlled studio environment. The detail worth knowing involves the practical bird effects themselves, created using a combination of trained birds and mechanical puppetry that the effects team has discussed in later interviews as considerably more logistically challenging than anticipated, given how unpredictably actual trained birds of prey behaved compared to the more controllable mechanical creature effects audiences typically associate with the era's horror productions. Killing Birds has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Claudio Lattanzi directed limited additional features following this production. The Louisiana filming locations have been identified by several genre historians studying the broader Italian horror production wave of the period. Witchery 1988, directed by Fabrizio Laurenti. A family renovating an isolated island hotel off the New England coast becomes trapped inside the building during a sudden storm, alongside a small group of strangers who arrived separately, all of them gradually realizing the structure itself is actively working to sacrifice them one by one to fulfill a centuries-old witch's curse that has never actually been broken. Fabrizio Laurenti built the production specifically targeting American horror audiences, despite the entirely Italian crew and financing, recognizing that the broader American VHS rental market had developed a specific appetite for exactly this kind of supernatural haunted house premise, regardless of where the production actually originated. American distribution proved considerably more successful than most films on this list, with the casting of Linda Blair and David Hasselhoff providing genuine name recognition that helped secure wider VHS rental placement across major American chains rather than relying exclusively on specialty import channels. The island hotel setting, filmed using an actual historic property whose isolated architecture gave Laurenti's camera genuine atmospheric dread no soundstage construction could replicate, became the production's defining visual asset throughout its practical effects sequences depicting the curse's increasingly violent manifestations. The detail worth knowing involves the casting strategy itself. Laurenti specifically pursued Blair and Hasselhoff because Italian producers had identified American genre name recognition as the single most effective tool for securing VHS shelf placement, a calculated commercial decision that proved successful enough to make Witchery one of the more commercially visible Italian horror exports of the entire decade. Witchery has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Fabrizio Laurenti directed limited additional features following this production. Linda Blair discussed the production occasionally in later convention interviews. Nightmare Beach, 1989. Directed by Umberto Lenzi. A motorcycle gang leader executed for murder returns from the dead during a college spring break celebration at a beachside town, beginning a methodical killing spree against the students whose testimony originally sent him to the electric chair, all while the local sheriff struggles to convince anyone that the killer riding through town on a motorcycle could possibly be exactly who everyone fears he is. Umberto Lenzi, already deeply established within Italian exploitation cinema, through his earlier Cannibal Cycle work, applied the same efficient genre instincts to this considerably more conventional slasher premise, betting specifically on the American spring break setting's commercial appeal. American distribution occurred primarily through direct-to-video release, the production specifically designed from inception to target the VHS rental market that had become the primary commercial pathway for mid-budget Italian horror exports by the decade's end. The beachside setting, filmed using actual Florida coastal locations standing in for the fictional town, gave Lenzi's practical effects team a genuinely sun-soaked, vacation-adjacent atmosphere that distinguished the production visually from the more gothic or jungle-set horror that had defined most of his earlier career output. The detail worth knowing involves the production's title history specifically. American distributors released the film under at least 2 different names, depending on regional VHS packaging, including Welcome to Spring Break, a marketing decision that occasionally confused collectors attempting to determine whether they were looking at one production or 2 separate releases entirely. Nightmare Beach has been released through various home video labels, including Code Red. Umberto Lenzi continued directing throughout the remainder of his career. The Florida filming locations have been identified by several genre historians, studying the broader wave of Italian-American horror co-productions from this period. Almost entirely Italian crews, almost entirely built for one specific audience that nobody else in the world seemed to want. American video stores became the only market patient enough to stock Nazi ghost ships, killer birds, and a witch's curse trapped inside a New England hotel. Witchery succeeded specifically because its producers understood Linda Blair's name on a VHS box mattered more than where the film was actually made. Which production on today's list surprised you most? Leave it in the comments. Subscribe if you want the rest of this decade covered properly.